When the car pulled away from the curb, she stood there with a paper envelope and a $10 bill that felt lighter than breath. The street hummed with quiet rain and expensive engines. The guards did not look at her. The driver did not look back. A man who once swore to build a whole life around her had just called her useless, signed a neat page to end their marriage, and left her with a farewell that could not even buy a full tank of gas. Her hands did not shake. A small smile rose and went nowhere, like a wave that decides not to touch the shore. She pressed the $10 flat with her palm, as if warmth could change what it was. She turned away from the glass tower, where she had learned to walk softly, talk gently, and take up less and less space. Above her, clouds gathered like tired thoughts. She could not climb back to the penthouse for one more look. She had already said goodbye to the air up there. Before all of this, her name moved easily through rooms. Aria. It sounded like a song when friends called it. She grew up in a small coastal town where the wind smelled like salt and bread, and where her mother kept a chipped blue bowl that had belonged to her grandmother. That bowl held many things: dough rising under a cloth, cherries waiting for sugar, coins stacked after long weeks. Aria loved how simple things could be turned into comfort. She folded napkins with square patience. She traced headlines in the morning paper and imagined her own name under them. She wanted to write. She wanted to sit in a corner of a café and make sense of the day for people who never had time to watch it closely. She moved to the city with a second-hand suitcase and a head of clean plans. She worked in a bookstore and wrote in the quiet hours. She wrote small essays about bus rides and market smells and the way strangers carry private storms on their faces. She met him at a charity event where she was pouring tea. His name was Nolan Royce, and his presence walked into rooms before he did. People made way for it. His voice had weight. His watch caught light like a small sun. He asked her about the book in her pocket and smiled when she held it up. He had that kind of smile that made the world feel like it had chosen a main character. She did not know he had practiced that smile for boardrooms and headlines. She did not know how carefully he arranged his charm, like cufflinks. At first. Their life felt like a high window that opened onto clean air. He put his hand on the small of her back as elevators closed. He sent flowers with cards where he wrote brief lines that looked like care. He took her to dinners where plates arrived like small sculptures. People at those tables made large plans with small movements. They were kind to her in the way people are kind to new birds. She watched their mouths form terms she did not use: leveraged, exit, runway. Nolan liked that she listened. He liked a still surface on which his reflection looked calm. Marriage came with soft lights and photographs framed in silver. In the early mornings, she found her own shape in the mirror and whispered a promise to keep herself. She remembered the chipped blue bowl and the weight of dough in her hands. She kept a notebook by the window and wrote about the city waking. But her pages grew thinner. She learned the rhythms of his schedule, his cologne, the temperature he preferred for the shower, the way he expected silence to settle like dust after his long days. The penthouse was high above the street. The windows were too large to open. The air was clean in a way that kept smell away. Time turned into smooth rooms, and the rooms thought for her. She forgot to look up at the sky. She forgot to finish paragraphs. Nolan's mother visited and arranged orchids in straight lines. She touched the spines of Aria's books with cautious fingers, as if they might bruise the furniture. There were rules that no one wrote. Guests should admire the art. Aria should speak briefly. She should thank the caterer with a small nod and not wipe the counter herself. Help was part of the price of beauty. When Aria tried to apply for a writing fellowship, the dates tangled with a family trip to the Alps. Nolan looked at her application and set it aside with a neat gesture that did not look like dismissal. He asked her to join him for the trip because visibility mattered. She went. Snow had never looked so perfect. She remembered the chipped blue bowl like a warm stone in a coat pocket. Her friends slowly stopped asking her to meet in cheap cafes. She said yes less and less, and they heard the echo of that. The penthouse liked quiet. Her body began to imitate the furniture. When she laughed too hard at a film, Nolan's eyes lifted a fraction. The fraction did the work. She learned to keep laughter close to the chest. The day things broke was not loud. It was a private Sunday after a public Friday. A photo of them at a gala had made its way into a paper that enjoyed sarcasm. The headline wondered what she brought to the empire besides a clear collarbone. It used sharper words, but the cut was the same. Nolan's newest deal was fragile. He spent Saturday in rooms with men who believed that order meant common taste. By Sunday afternoon, the temperature in the penthouse had fallen without touching the thermostat. He called her to the table and placed a folder in front of her. His ring tapped the wood once. He spoke in short lines that the lawyer had likely drafted. He spoke about image and expectations and the need to align with the future. His words fell like screws. Eustace landed last. It did not bounce. He slid an envelope across the table. The envelope held a single $10 bill, an insult arranged as clarity. He liked clean endings. She did not perform grief for him. She stood and touched the back of the chair as if to steady it. She put the $10 in her pocket and packed a bag that held less than she owned and more than he understood. She left. The elevator hummed down without complaint. On the street, the rain cleared the smell of the city and left it bare. She walked until the tall buildings leaned away. She sat inside a small station where commuters passed like a river. She held the 10 in both hands. She remembered her mother pressing a single bill flat before buying flour. Her mother used to say that food knows if you are angry. Aria looked at the bill and tried to make her mind quiet. She found a hostel with a narrow bed and a metal locker. The room smelled like disinfectant and detergent that never fully rinsed. The next morning, she bought a loaf of dialed bread and a packet of instant yeast. She found a listing for a church kitchen that rented by the hour for community use. The manager looked at her backpack and her shoes and pointed to a clipboard. She signed her name with careful letters. She offered to sweep the storage room for a discount. No one argued with a person holding a broom. That night, she stood in a kitchen with tired appliances and stainless steel counters that reflected a thin version of her. She placed warm water in a bowl and watched yeast wake at the surface like small hope. She added flour with slow hands and turned the dough until it began to hold itself. The smell of it lifted her chest. She shaped rolls by feel, not by measure. She thought of the hospital 3 blocks away, where night nurses left at dawn and day nurses arrived with coffee. She imagined their hands. She brushed the rolls with melting butter right before the oven. When sunrise offered a thin pink ribbon at the edge of the window, she placed the warm rolls in a cardboard box, crossed the street, and set up near a bus stop with a thermos of tea she made from old leaves and kindness. People came in 2s and 1s. Some passed with a glance that said no to everything. Some slowed for the smell, for the steam that rose like a small comfort from a hard surface. She kept her eyes soft. She handed out napkins with both hands, as if they were gifts. A janitor with a heavy bag took a roll and placed 3 coins in the cup. He did not look at her. She watched him chew with a tired mouth and looked away, giving him space for private hunger. A resident with a crooked tie took 4 and did not ask the price. He placed a folded bill on the box and hurried off. A woman in scrubs touched the edge of a roll and smiled with her whole face. That slow smile that people give to strangers who help at the right moment. By 9, her box was empty. Her feet ached as if she had carried a child across a slow river. Her cup held more than $10. It was not much more, but it was a number that did not belong to him. She returned to the kitchen by noon and cleaned the sink until the metal showed its original patience. She booked the same hours for the next week. She wrote a note to herself and left it inside the locker with the backpack. Keep the scent of butter away from regret. On the 3rd day, rain returned and bullied the morning. She stood under a borrowed umbrella that trembled in the wind. The rolls steamed like brave little boats. People crossed the street to avoid splashes, and some ignored her completely. A child spotted the box and tugged on a sleeve. The mother stopped long enough to buy one. The child bit down and closed his eyes like prayer. Aria's chest warmed more than the tea. She began to build a rhythm, late-night mixing, early morning selling, quiet afternoons with spreadsheets she learned to make from free videos in the library. She tracked costs. She learned where flour stayed cheap. She found a market stall owner who traded her a bag of sugar for 24 warm rolls that he gave his crew at dawn. She stopped using the thermos and asked a retired man who sold newspapers if she could rent a corner of his cart for a small metal urn. He liked the smell of cinnamon. He waved his hand and told her to place it next to yesterday's headlines. They formed a small team without saying much. He began to keep an extra chair for her. People started calling her the morning girl. She heard it in passing. She looked up one day and realized she had regulars. They stood with their palms wrapped around paper cups and used her corner of the sidewalk like a waiting room for hope. She began to add small notes inside the paper bag. The notes were only a few words. You did your best today. 1 hour at a time. Your work matters. She wrote them sitting on the hostel bed while the laundry hummed in the hall. She kept the notes simple and steady, the way rain is simple and steady when it is kind. A woman named Alina noticed the notes. Alina wore a coat that had earned its scuffs. Her eyes were the color of strong tea. She worked nights at a shelter and spent mornings walking slowly because the world did not rush at that hour. She started staying by the cart longer, asking if she could help stir the tea so Aria could hand out change faster. She told Aria about a community kitchen 2 blocks farther that had a broken oven but better storage. Aria listened and made a face that was not quite a smile and not quite a plan. Alina introduced her to the kitchen manager, who turned out to be a retired chef with hands like maps. He grunted when he heard about bread and $10. He sent her home with a dented baking tray and a bag of cinnamon sticks, like a blessing hidden in metal. It was not simple. There were days when the dough refused to rise. There were nights when another group booked the kitchen by mistake, and she sat on the steps with her box on her lap, watching the hours she needed cross the street and disappear into a brighter building. There were mornings when the rain came sideways and lifted the corners of her cardboard sign and turned her hair into a dark rope. Once, a man in an expensive coat brushed the box with his sleeve and sent for rolls sliding to the ground. He kept walking. She watched the rolls soak on the concrete, like small ships that had given up. She took a breath and did not cry. She gave the next customer 2 for $1 and cleaned the sidewalk with a rag that never came back to the hostel. There were also small moments that would have seemed too soft to be useful if they had not been real. A bus driver pulled up an inch closer to the curb on windy days. A nurse left an extra pair of food service gloves under the urn in a folded paper towel. The newspaper man began to keep his old wool scarf in the cart so she could borrow it when dawn leaned cold. A city inspector came by with a clipboard and a face that could set a room straight. He asked about her permits, and she handed over every paper she had managed to collect with Elena's help. He looked through them slowly. He tapped the line where her name sat low. He nodded once and told her to add a lid for the teacups that actually fit. He left without closing the lid on hope. In the 7th week, a woman paused under a blue umbrella that had a gold trim. She wore a raincoat that looked like it had a quiet opinion about price. She bought a roll and ate it, standing there, holding the umbrella with one hand and the bag with the other. She glanced at the little note tucked inside and read it with a still face. Then she folded it and placed it in her coat pocket as if saving a map. The next day she returned with a friend. The day after that she arrived alone and introduced herself with a card. It carried the name of a small investment firm and a title that would have made Nolan's jaw tilt an approving degree. Her name was Margaret Klein. She asked if Aria had ever thought of selling more than rolls. Aria kept her eyes on the steam. She thought of the chipped blue bowl and of mornings that had made their own rules. She said she had thought about it in the way people think about sunlight in winter. Margaret asked to see where the bread came to life. They walked to the community kitchen under a sky that had finally decided to be kind. Margaret ran a hand over the chipped tiles and smiled like someone who preferred tools that had already proven themselves. She asked about costs and hours. She did not talk about scaling or burn rate. She asked if Aria had time to breathe. At the end of the visit, she placed a set of keys in Aria's palm. It was a small storefront 2 blocks over. It had been a florist's shop once. The windows still held the ghosts of petals. Margaret said she had been looking for a reason to keep it in the neighborhood. She liked reasons that smelled like butter. There would be a simple lease, almost gentle. There would be a microloan with a kind interest rate that did not punish. There would be time to grow like real bread. Aria sat on the old florist's floor. That night, and pressed her palms into the dust as if testing soil, she leaned her head against the pale wall and closed her eyes. She could see the counter. She could see a small display case that did not rush. She could see a corner with a table and 2 chairs for people who needed a place to sit before facing the day. She could see a framed $10 bill hanging in a simple wooden frame behind the register. A quiet joke the universe would understand. The opening was not grand. It was a morning like any other, but the light found reasons to be tender. Alina wiped the glass with slow circles. The newspaper man turned his cart so his stack faced her front door. A hand-painted sign above the window read "Gentle Hands." The first customer was the janitor from the hospital, the one who had placed 3 coins in her cup without meeting her eyes. He stood a little taller now. He pointed to the cinnamon rolls without words. She slid a warm plate across the counter and added an extra without ceremony. He took them away like a person carrying a small sleeping animal. Word spread the way warm smells spread through open doors, through someone's laughter as it finally remembered itself, through the quiet announcement of a satisfied sigh. People liked the story, too. They liked that the $10 sat in the frame without bitterness. They liked that the notes still arrived in the bags. They liked that the café did not ask them to be anything other than tired and hopeful. The menu grew, not in width, but in heart. She added a simple soup that leaned on vegetables and patience. She served it in bowls that felt good to hold. Women started asking if she needed help. Some needed a second chance. Some needed a first one. Aria began to hire them. She taught them how to feel the dough without arguing with it. She taught them to breathe before they opened the oven door. She put their names on the schedule in ink that did not flicker. She found that teaching fed the parts of her that writing had fed. Her sentences turned into instructions that made someone's day easier. She watched shoulders drop. She watched faces lift. Months folded themselves neatly and placed themselves on a shelf. She stopped counting how many days it had been since the car pulled away from the curb. The café filled with ordinary rituals. That built a different kind of empire. The kid from the after-school program doing homework by the window while a roll cooled on a napkin. The nurse who touched the bells on the door with the same gentleness she gave to newborns. The older man who read the paper at the corner table and tore out the crossword for Aria when she had a minute. Elena's laughed from the kitchen, like a pot simmering at the right temperature. One afternoon in late autumn, a catering company canceled on a corporate client an hour before a board luncheon. A young assistant with a face lit by several screens stood on the sidewalk, eyes wide, words tumbling into her phone. She looked up at the street and scanned for a miracle that could carry plates. She spotted the line at Gentle Hands and walked in. She met the smell first, and then Aria's steady eyes. She asked for help with the kind of urgency that does not need to dress up as charm. Aria looked at the clock on the wall and then at the trays cooling on the rack. She thought of a day when she had needed someone to move an inch closer to the curb. She nodded and began to fill boxes with careful hands. They delivered the food to a building with glass walls that knew their own worth. Aria carried a tray and followed the assistant through a maze of rooms that had seen decisions change weather. They stopped outside a conference room with a door that reflected the hallway like a quiet lake. Aria set the tray down on a long table and turned. The door opened. He stepped out. Recognition moved across Nolan's face like a cloud losing interest in the sun. For a moment, the hallway became the elevator from another year. His jaw found an old position. Then it softened. His eyes dropped to the logo on the boxers, to the little line beneath it that read, "Warm bread, warm hands." He looked at the tray of cinnamon rolls and then at her palms, which were pink from the oven. He started to form a word and did not finish it. Aria did not supply the rest. She lifted the empty tray and held it like a shield that did not need to be used. Inside the room, people in suits filled plates and let the smell do their small talk for them. A man with a generous tie asked about the café. The assistant answered with more enthusiasm than anyone expected. She told the short version of the story. She skipped the envelope and the $10 because there are rooms where that detail would do the wrong work. Nolan stood still, watching the tray he might have knocked from someone else's hands on another day. He followed her to the service door with steps that did not know whether to be heavy or light. In the hallway, he stopped with a small breath that landed like change on a counter. He touched his cufflink and looked, for the first time, like someone with no practiced line. His lips moved. His throat worked. He did not speak because there are moments when words would only make smoke around a truth that is already clear. He nodded, once, as if to an invisible judge. She nodded back, not with victory, but with recognition. Then she left, moving through a building that had once sent her down in silence. He came to the café a week later. He stood by the door like a man who had walked through rain without an umbrella. Customers turned to look without leaning into cruelty. He approached the counter slowly and placed his hands on the wood that Alina had sanded smooth. Aria wiped her palms on her apron and stood facing him. He reached into his pocket, then stopped. He looked at the framed $10 on the wall and gave a small laugh that had no joy in it, only surprise at how life can draw a circle without asking permission. He slid a check across the counter without flourish. It was not payment for anything. It was an apology that had learned to write in numbers. He gestured, not toward her, but toward the women in the kitchen, toward the packed menu board, toward the little notes folded in baskets on the counter. He asked if she could use it to do more of this. His eyes did not beg, they did not demand. They held the quiet of someone who has watched his reflection change shapes. Aria lifted the check and folded it. In half, without looking at the amount, she placed it under the register and then lifted it again and handed it back. She told him to give it to the shelter where Alina spent her nights. She told him to do it quietly, with no press release and no naming rights. She pointed to a jar next to the register. It held folded bills for a new program she had started. Small grants for women who needed a beginning no larger than a bus ticket and a bag of groceries. The note on the jar read only 10. She asked him, with a tilt of her chin instead of words, to understand what it meant to start small and true. He closed his eyes for a second that held a year. He put the check in the jar, folding it like a white flag. He left without taking a single roll. The cafe kept growing, in the way houses grow when you fill them with stories. Aria added a quiet reading night once a week. People came to sit and listen to simple pages read aloud. They came because the world had been loud all day. She began to write again in the early mornings, her notebook open on the counter right where the light fell. She wrote about the smell of caramelized sugar at 5 a.m. She wrote about a nurse who slept at the corner table for 10 minutes with her forehead on her sleeve while the city forgave her snore. She wrote about a child who learned to tie his shoe by the window while his mother practiced the word interview under her breath. She wrote about hands. News of the cafe reached places that knew how to amplify kindness without breaking it. A reporter came and bought a roll and asked no questions at first. He sat and watched, then wrote an article that sounded like a warm afternoon. He did not mention the billionaire. He focused on yeast and patience. On the way, a person who has been called useless can become a light that does not care if there is a stage. People sent letters to the cafe addressed to the morning girl. They enclosed $10, sometimes more, and notes of their own. Keep going. Give this to someone who needs a beginning. Aria placed each letter in a tin box. She used the money to make the jar deeper. She kept the notes in a drawer for the days when the dough stayed stubborn. On a winter evening, she hosted a small event and called it First Loaves. The women who worked in the kitchen invited someone they knew who needed a start. Aria told the story of the chipped blue bowl of the church kitchen, of the cardboard box by the bus stop. She did not name names of harm. She named the street, the smell, the first coins. The day the rain came sideways and still someone stayed, she handed out 6 envelopes. Each held $10 and a list of places that said yes without paperwork. Each held a promise of 2 hours in her kitchen and her eyes on their hands until their hands could trust themselves. Later that night, after the last light had been turned off and the bell above the door had made its small final sound, Aria locked the front and leaned her forehead against the cool glass. The street reflected a simple version of her face. She turned and looked at the frame behind the counter. The bill sat in its square like a leaf caught forever in a kind block of resin. She stepped closer and noticed a smudge at the corner where someone's curious. Child had pressed a finger earlier in the day. She did not wipe it away. She let it stay. It made the frame feel alive. She thought of Nolan then, not with heat, but with distance. She knew he had made choices since she had heard, without seeking, that his company had stumbled and then shifted. He had donated to the shelter without speaking to a camera. He had started showing up for his own hours. She imagined him sometimes at his kitchen counter, learning to fry an egg without burning it, trying to make a small bowl of soup taste like something. The thought did not thrill her. It did not hurt her. It passed through her like a sad bird that knows the way home but chooses not to land. Years passed the way well-made bread cools. They settled. They formed a crust that kept the inside soft. Gentle Hands opened a second location near a school, where children would otherwise eat between classes. What the vending machines decided was a good idea. Aria kept the jar on the counter in both places. She kept the 10 in the frame. She kept the note simple and true, adding one that said, "You are not the worst thing someone called you." She kept the reading nights. She kept writing. One morning in spring, she stood by the window before the first customers came. The city was new again, the way it always is before it begins. Alina brewed tea in the back, humming a song that had no sharp edges. The newspaper man now retired sat on a stool near the counter, smoothing out a page with both hands. A young woman stood at the door with a baby in a sling and looked inside as if checking if dreams had an entrance fee. Aria lifted the latch, and the bell welcomed them. If you had told her, on the day the car pulled away, that she would stand here with flour on her apron and laughter nested in the rafters, she might have smiled with the same small wave that never reached the shore. It would have sounded like a story people tell to make bad days feel temporary. But here she was. The world had not changed its nature. It was still cruel sometimes. It was still loud. It still rewarded the sharp, but it also rewarded those who rose each dawn to make something warm for hands that had been cold all night. It still answered quiet persistence with a table and a chair. She looked at the frame one more time. The 10 stared back, thin and patient. It had been both an insult and a seed. It had been a door she could not hold open, and a window she had learned to climb through. She knew now that the power of money starts or ends at the hand that holds it. In her hands, it had bought flour and time. In his hands, it had tried to buy a quieter ending. She smiled at the difference and let the thought go the way steam leaves bread. The door opened. Morning entered with its soft suitcase of light. The first customer of the day reached into her pocket for change and paused when she saw the jar. She read the words only 10 and nodded like someone who understood small beginnings. She placed a bill in the jar and took her bag with both hands. She tucked the note inside the bag into her coat pocket, where it would touch her phone, her keys, and the day's list. Outside, a bus sighed and moved on. Aria watched all of it, the way someone watches a garden after the first rain. She felt a voice rise in her chest, calm and steady, the one that speaks in kitchens at dawn when no one else is listening. It said that some endings try to make you small. It said that some beginnings fit in the palm of your hand. It said that usefulness is not measured by rooms with glass walls and sharp suits, but by how many hands you can warm before noon. She turned back to the counter. She placed a tray of rolls in the case and took a breath that tasted like cinnamon and quiet victory. Somewhere in the city, a man in a high office looked out at a line of trees planted to convince glass they were human. He stood still for a long time, remembering a morning when his reflection changed and kept changing. He did not call. He did not need to. The story had already decided where to rest, and if, years from now, someone walks into a café on a street that has forgotten how old it is, and if that someone looks up and sees a framed $10 behind a counter where the air tastes like sugar and patience, they might feel a small lift in the chest. They might think of what anger can turn into when hands refuse to harden. They might carry that thought into the day like a warm paper bag. They might not know her name. They might not know the man or the car or the elevator that sang going down. They will know only the smell, the note tucked inside, and the way the bell above the door sounds like a promise kept. And when the wind moves along that street and pushes the scent as far as it can, it will feel for a moment like the city itself is breathing with her. And that breath will say, softly, that nothing given to the right morning is ever useless. He used to wake up to city noise that sounded like applause. Now, the mornings were quieter, but not in peace, just absence. Nolan Royce had everything he once thought mattered, but none of it felt real anymore. His empire still carried his name, printed in sharp metal at the entrance of glass buildings, but his presence inside them had faded into whispers. He had built walls so high that even his own voice didn't echo back. He lived now in a smaller apartment, not poor by any means, but stripped of the grand noise that used to surround him. No marble floors, no orchids on the counter, no staff waiting for instructions. Just a man in a refrigerator that hummed too loud. He made coffee in a chipped mug he'd found in a corner shop downstairs. The handle was slightly broken, but he liked how it reminded him that some things stay strong even with cracks. He hadn't seen Aria in years. He had seen her cafe in a magazine once, Gentle Hands. A short article had called it the heart of a busy city. He had read every word slowly, as if they were written in another language he needed to learn. There was a photograph, too. She was standing behind the counter, wearing an apron dusted with flour. Her smile soft but grounded, the kind that had no interest in pretending anymore. He had stared at that smile until the print blurred. That image haunted him, not in pain. It was the proof of what he had lost by confusing control with love back then. He had thought success was about how many people waited for him to speak. Now, silence had become the only thing that truly listened. His company had changed direction after a series of bad deals. Investors had pulled back quietly, the way guests leave a party when the music falters. The news had written about it for a few days, but then found something else to feed on. That's how the world works. Empires fall quietly, and people only care until the next scandal arrives. Nolan had tried to rebuild, not the company, but himself. But rebuilding a man is harder than rebuilding a business. Money can't fix what pride destroys. He started volunteering at the shelter where Aria had once sent him to donate. The staff there recognized him, but no one mentioned his name. They just handed him gloves and a bucket. He mopped floors and served soup. The first few days felt strange. His hands, used to signing deals and holding pens, now held ladles and sponges. But as the days passed, he started to understand the weight of small acts, the quiet dignity of cleaning something you didn't break, of helping someone who didn't owe you anything. Sometimes, he heard her name whispered by the volunteers Aria from Gentle Hands. They spoke of her bread like a blessing. Once, a young woman came in with a bag of her rolls and handed them to the kitchen staff, saying they were from the café's Hope Fund. Nolan had stood still, watching that bag on the counter, the scent of cinnamon filling the room. He hadn't expected the smell of forgiveness to be so familiar. Months turned into a year. The shelter grew. A new program began, small grants for women trying to start over. He saw the jars labeled only 10 and recognized the story behind them before anyone had to explain. That was when he knew she hadn't just rebuilt her life. She had rebuilt others. She had turned what he threw away into something that fed strangers. And somehow, she had done it without bitterness. That realization humbled him in a way no loss ever had. He stopped driving luxury cars. He started walking to places he used to send others. He bought bread from Gentle Hands once, long after his first visit. She wasn't there that day. The girl at the counter recognized him from old photos, her eyes flickering with surprise, but she didn't speak it. She packed his bag carefully and slipped in one of those small folded notes Aria was known for. He opened it later, sitting alone on a bench by the river. The note said, "Growth begins where ego ends." He held it for a long time. It felt like a verdict and a prayer. He began to write letters, not to send, but to understand. Letters to himself. To the version of him who thought power made him loved. To the man who measured worth in silence. To the woman who had walked away with nothing but $10 and found everything. He never mailed them. He folded them neatly and placed them inside a wooden box by his bed. He knew words had a way of forgiving us, even when people cannot. His hair grayed around the edges. His eyes softened. He opened a foundation in Aria's honor. Anonymously, it provided training, microloans, and resources for small women-led businesses. He named it the Gentle Fund. When the press asked why he did it, he said, "Because I once knew someone who taught me that kindness builds better empires than ambition ever could." They printed it as a quote. Not knowing its full story, he visited Gentle Hands one last time, years later. Aria was older now, but time had been kind. The cafe looked bigger, yet still smelled like the same cinnamon and patience. She was serving an older couple at the counter, her movements slow and graceful. He waited until she looked up and met his eyes. She smiled, not out of surprise, not out of longing, just with quiet acceptance. That kind of peace doesn't need history to explain itself. He placed a small envelope on the counter and turned to leave. Inside it was a note that said, "The day you left, I lost everything that didn't matter. Thank you." And beneath it, a check made out to Gentle Hands Community School Project. When he stepped outside, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds and fell across the street in a single soft line, just enough to touch both his shoes and the cafe door. He paused for a moment, looked at the window, and saw his reflection beside hers. For the first time, they looked like equals, not in wealth, but in understanding. He walked away without looking back, and she watched him go without sadness. Some stories don't need reunion, they just need peace. And from that day forward, the world carried their two names in different directions. Hers with warmth, his with humility. Two souls that had once broken each other now quietly held the same truth, that love is not proven by possession, but by what survives after goodbye. And somewhere in the city, when the wind moved past the cafe door at dusk, it carried the faintest scent of cinnamon, like forgiveness finally learning how to breathe. The cafe had changed, but the air inside still smelled of warmth. The walls were lighter now, painted in soft cream instead of the old faded blue, but the $10 bill still hung in its frame above the counter. Dust never stayed on it for long. Someone always wiped it clean, a small ritual of respect that no one questioned. Aria was slower now, but steady. Her hair had turned the color of soft ash, tied loosely at the back. She no longer needed dough every dawn, but her hands still moved with the same patience when she folded the morning receipts. The cafe had grown into a quiet landmark, the kind of place where strangers met and left as if leaving behind part of their stories. She had begun mentoring younger women, some who had lost jobs, others who had lost faith. They came to her kitchen, not to bake, but to breathe. She taught them the art of calm work, of mixing struggle with grace until both could rise. Among them was a young woman named Lena. She was 23, with quick eyes and quiet ambition. Her mother had worked 3 shifts to raise her. Her father had left before she was born. Lena found comfort in Aria's calmness, in the way she spoke about failure as if it were part of a recipe. Aria saw something of her younger self in Lena, the same hunger to be seen, the same careful way of hiding pain behind efficiency. Lena became more than a trainee. She became the cafe's heartbeat. She brought new ideas, social media posts that told stories, photos of old customers, donation drives with soft words and real results. She called it Stories That Stay Warm. People from across the city began donating, not because of pity, but because the cafe made them believe in goodness again. One day, Lena received an invitation through email. A large firm, Royce Foundation for Ethical Business, was offering grants for small community enterprises that empowered women. She recognized the name, of course. Everyone in the city did. Nolan Royce, the billionaire who had stepped back from his empire years ago and turned to philanthropy. His foundation had funded schools, shelters, and projects that changed quiet corners of the city. Lena brought the idea to Aria. She thought the cafe could expand its mentorship into a full training school, teaching women to bake, budget, and begin again. Aria looked at the invitation for a long time without speaking. The name on the letter felt like a ghost she had already forgiven. She smiled faintly and said, "Only apply, my dear. Sometimes grace has a way of returning when you're ready to see it." Lena wrote the proposal herself, late at night, under the hum of the kitchen's old fan. She didn't know she was writing a new chapter of someone else's unfinished story. Weeks passed. Then, one afternoon, a man in a light gray coat stepped through the cafe door. His hair was silver now, his eyes gentler, his steps slower. He looked around with a quiet familiarity, as though every scent carried a memory. It was Nolan. He was not there to seek forgiveness that had already happened in silence. He was there as the head of the foundation, following up on a shortlisted project. He hadn't known the cafe, applying for the grant, was Gentle Hands, the same one that had once stood as his mirror of shame and redemption. When he saw the framed $10 bill, the air in his chest tightened. He hadn't seen it in years, but it still looked untouched, like time had respected it. Aria wasn't there that day. Lena greeted him, unaware of the history standing in front of her. She explained the project with calm pride, her words soft but certain. Nolan listened carefully, noting every detail. But what struck him most was the tone, the same steady kindness that Aria once carried. He asked Lena how she came to this place. She told him about the mentorship program, about how Aria helped women start over, about how this cafe wasn't just a business, it was a home for those who'd lost their direction. Nolan's eyes softened as she spoke. He asked quietly, "And this woman, Aria, what is she like?" Lena smiled. "She's everything gentle people are supposed to be, the kind that rebuilds you without asking for your story." Something inside him eased. He looked around again, at the people laughing softly, at the smell of fresh bread, at the simple glass jar, still labeled only 10. It felt like walking into a prayer that never ended. He left his card and told Lena the foundation would review her proposal. When he stepped outside, he paused at the same spot he had years ago. The sunlight fell across the window, exactly as before. For a moment, he imagined Aria behind the counter, smiling the way she did when life had finally taught her peace. He smiled back to no one and walked away. Weeks later, the grant was approved. A letter arrived with a gold-embossed seal and a simple message. For the hands that never stopped creating light. The Royce Foundation, Lena, was overjoyed. She ran to Aria with the letter in her hand. But when Aria read the name, she only closed her eyes and took a deep, slow breath. She whispered something that Lena couldn't hear, maybe a prayer, maybe just gratitude, and placed the letter next to the framed bill. With the grant, they opened a small training center behind the café. The Gentle School. It became a refuge for women learning to start again. The first plaque on the wall read, "Strength begins in silence." Months later, an envelope arrived, addressed to Aria personally. No company logo this time, just a handwritten line. "Thank you for what you taught me." Inside was a photo, Nolan standing in a rural field beside a group of women starting a farming cooperative. The caption read, "The Gentle Fund, Expansion 5. Aria looked at the photo for a long moment and then placed it beside the $10 frame. Not as a memory of pain, but as a reminder that even broken threads can weave back into something whole. Lena noticed the new picture the next morning. She asked softly, "Who's that, Ms. Aria?" Aria smiled, that same soft smile that held years of both sorrow and grace. Just someone who finally learned the value of gentleness. Lena didn't ask more. Some stories are told best by silence. Years later, after Aria passed away peacefully in her sleep, the cafe remained open. Lena kept everything as it was. The $10 frame, the jar labeled only 10, the photo of Nolan's foundation. People said the cafe still felt like Aria's hands were there, dusting flour from the counter. And sometimes, when the morning sun streamed through the front window, the framed bill would catch the light and glow faintly, as if reminding everyone that even what was once meant to hurt can end up lighting a room far across the city. Nolan kept a photo of gentle hands on his desk. He visited once every year, always quietly, always alone. He never stayed long. He would sit near the window, order a single roll, and watch the people come and go. He never asked for anyone's attention. He didn't need to. The smell of cinnamon and forgiveness did the talking for him, and every time he left, the bell above the cafe door would ring softly like a goodbye that no longer carried pain, only peace. Time moved softly through the cafe after Aria's passing. It didn't announce its presence. It showed itself in small things, the faded corner of a recipe card, the slow rhythm of the morning bell. The way Lena sometimes turned her head, as if expecting to hear Aria's footsteps in the kitchen. The world outside kept changing. Buildings rose higher, cars grew quieter, and screens replaced many faces. But gentle hands remained the same, a corner of stillness in a city that rushed past itself. Lena had grown into her own calm now. She was in her 30s, with lines of grace forming around her eyes. She carried Aria's voice in her memory, that gentle reminder to work with warmth, not hurry. Under her care, the cafe had expanded to 3 locations, each one carrying the same $10 frame and the same little jar marked only 10. The second branch stood by the harbor, where fishermen brought their catch before dawn. The third opened near a hospital, serving night shift nurses who craved warmth before the sun. But the original cafe, the one with the creaking wooden door and the faint smell of cinnamon in its walls, remained sacred. One spring morning, Lena decided to renovate the back kitchen. The tiles had cracked with age, and a small leak had formed near the sink. She wanted to preserve the place, not change it, just give it strength again, like repairing an old heart that still beats dot when the workers removed the plaster near the back wall. They found something wedged between 2 wooden beams, a small metal tin, rusted at the edges, wrapped in parchment. One of them called Lena over quietly. She recognized the handwriting immediately before she even touched it. The letters were soft and slanted Arias. She held the tin like something sacred, wiping dust away with her sleeve. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and a photograph faded by time. The photo showed Aria and Nolan standing together in front of the cafe on its opening day. She had never seen that image before. They weren't smiling for the camera. They were simply looking at each other calm, knowing, grateful. The letter beneath it was dated 15 years earlier. It read, "To whoever finds this, if you are reading these words, it means time has done what it always does, moved us forward. This cafe was born from pain, but it survived on kindness. If walls could speak, these ones would tell stories of women who came here to start over, of strangers who became family, of mornings that refused to give up. There was a man once who called me useless. He left me with $10, and I turned it into warmth. Years later, that same man returned, not as a ghost of regret, but as proof that even the proud can change. We learned something in the silence between us, that forgiveness doesn't always end with reunion. Sometimes it ends with peace that needs no words. If you are the next to hold this cafe, remember, its walls are built from stories, not cement. Every loaf you bake, every note you write, carries a breath of all who stood here before. Use your hands gently, and life will answer in kind." Aria Lena read the letter twice, her hands trembling slightly. She sat on the floor, surrounded by the smell of dust and history, and let tears fall quietly, not from sadness, but from the strange beauty of seeing love end the way it should. She placed the letter in a glass frame beside the $10 bill. Customers paused to read it as they waited for their orders. Some smiled, some cried. Some just stood in silence, feeling something they couldn't name. The story of gentle hands began to spread again, not through newspapers this time, but through hearts. People came not just for bread, but for hope. They spoke of the cafe as if it were alive, and in a way, it was. A year later, Lena opened a new branch abroad, a small coastal town by the Mediterranean, where seagulls flew low and the smell of salt clung to every morning. She named it Gentle Hands Abroad, but locals simply called it Aria's Place. The first thing she did, after unlocking the new cafe, was hang 2 frames on the wall, one with a copy of the $10 bill, another with Aria's letter. Beneath them, she placed a small plaque that read, "Forgiveness travels farther than memory." On opening day, the townspeople gathered. Lena baked the first loaf herself. As she sliced it, she whispered the same words Aria used to say, "May it rise gently." Somewhere, miles away in the city that started it all, Nolan Royce sat by his window watching the evening light turn golden. He was an old man now, quiet and content. On his desk sat the original copy of Aria's letter. She had sent it to him before sealing the one on the wall, a gift of truth before time carried them apart. He reread it every spring, not out of guilt, but out of gratitude. He had spent the last years funding small cafes, workshops, and schools in her name, always anonymously. It was his way of keeping her light moving. When he heard that Gentle Hands Abroad had opened, he smiled faintly. He closed his eyes and pictured Aria standing by the sea, her apron fluttering, her hair silver, her hands dusted with flour, the woman who taught him that gentleness is not weakness, and that starting over is the bravest form of victory. He died peacefully that same year, a photograph of Gentle Hands by his bedside. At his funeral, the foundation revealed a new initiative, the Aria Royce Fund for Second Chances. The statement read, "For those who were once told they couldn't, may they rise anyway." Lena attended the memorial. She stood near the back, holding a small loaf wrapped in linen. She placed it on the memorial table beside the flowers. She whispered, "Thank you," though she wasn't sure to whom, to him, to Aria, or to the life they had unknowingly built together. Years later, children played outside Aria's place by the sea. The smell of cinnamon drifted into the wind. Inside, on the wall, the letter stayed, its ink slightly faded, its truth still clear. Visitors often paused to read it, their eyes softening, their hearts quieting, and every time the sea breeze entered the cafe through the open window, it carried a whisper that no one could quite hear, something gentle, like a thank you stretched across time. Some stories do not end. They simply rest in other hands.